Hello everybody, it's Sarah, and today I am back with another review. And this review is a review that, not gonna lie, I am kind of nervous about because I just want to do justice to the series so badly. Because while I was already on my way there and I was already pretty sure that it was gonna end there after having read the first two books in this series, after I have now finished the third book in this series, this series has now become my all-time favorite series of all time, like on the very top. And I do not give the title lightly. So yeah, I really want to do this series justice, as I said, and the series that I'm talking about, as you will already know from the title, also maybe if you've seen my recent video talking about my all-time favorite series, the series that I'm talking about is the Rook and Rose series by M.A. Carrick. Now, this review is going to not be the way that I usually do my reviews. I will not talk about positives and negatives. Well, mostly because I just don't have that many negatives to say. Like, there's some elements where I might say, hey, if you're a reader who prefers this, then maybe, you know that this is what you're getting into with this series. But generally speaking, I just, I don't have many negative things to say about this series. Like, I have one thing where I'm like, okay, maybe, it's not to everyone's preference, but I didn't care, so whatever. But aside from that, I don't have any negatives, so no point in using that to structure my review. So I will talk about, things like plot, writing, characters, etc. And also trying to talk about how things changed from book to book. I also have already uploaded a spoiler-free with a spoilery ending review of The Mask of Mirrors, which is the first book in the series. I uploaded that when I first read it, and I will leave that review linked down below, so go and check it out if you're interested specifically on my thoughts on the first book, which I won't go into too much again with this review. And so yeah, let me tell you before we get into my thoughts what this series is actually about. This is an adult high fantasy series that I would say fits into a bunch of different subgenres within the high fantasy genre. So there's definitely some political fantasy in there, there's a lot of magic, there's some epic fantasy sprinkled in there as well, so there's just a lot of different elements within the story that I just think are woven together beautifully. Also, it's 3 books, it's a trilogy, obviously. The first book is, as I've already mentioned, The Mask of Mirrors. The second book is The Liar's Knot, and the third book, which I do not own physically yet because the UK publication date is only today as I'm filming this video, or as I'm uploading this video actually, if I remember correctly, is The Labyrinth's Heart, or Labyrinth's Heart. And so yeah, the US publication was a few days ago, UK publication is today. And the last thing that I forgot to mention before I get into a synopsis, M.A. Carrick is actually a pen name for an author duo made up of Marie Brennan and Alice Helms. And I will probably get to the two of them later because, yeah, there's a reason why I love this series so much, and it has something to do with the background of the two authors. So I tried to put up the books somewhat behind me, let's hope they don't fall over, but let me tell you what this series is about, and let me try to not go into too deep of a synopsis because I have a tendency with this series. But basically, this series is set in this very vibrant and colorful city called Nadesda, which is it has multiple different inspirations, but one of the first inspirations that becomes apparent, also because of the important role that masks kind of play in the series, there's this association. It's kind of reminiscent of Venice a little bit. And within the city, you have multiple different classes. You have the Rosenians, who are basically a colonized people. You have the Nadestans, people of often mixed heritage who have lived in the city for generations. And you have the nobles, whose heritage most often is from the colonizers. And so within the city, our main character Ren grew up. She grew up within the Knots, which are kind of the city's street gangs. However, a few years ago she had to leave, and now she has come back, and she wants to use her talents as a con artist to con her way into a noble family and never have to worry about anything ever again. Since this is an adult high fantasy series, Ren's perspective obviously isn't the only one we follow. She's just the central main character, but we also follow a bunch of the nobles that she's trying to, you know, get friendly with. We follow a crime boss who maybe is a little bit more than he seems, and he also has a very fun and vibrant spider as a sidekick. We follow a captain of the city guard who is struggling with a lot of things, and with his loyalties and with what his job demands of him. There's a masked vigilante fighting against the nobles of the city, and while all those different characters are struggling with their own motivations, there's children going missing, turning back up, but not being able to sleep. And that's just the general setup of the first book. So yeah, there's a lot going on. Now, I was wondering what I should start with in terms of talking, and so let me just first start with kind of talking about the plot and the writing, because I was considering talking about the two of them separately, but to be honest, the two of them are so intertwined that it's kind of hard to talk about them separately. First of all, this series, I think, like, especially the first book, if you're not used to a lot of adult high fantasy, can seem quite slow-paced. For me, especially with the second and third book, because I'm so just caught up within the plot and within the characters and with what's going on, the second and third book felt a lot more faster-paced. However, I remember when I started the first book, it was slow-paced for me as well, which I actually prefer. I prefer slow-paced over fast-paced books, so that's something good, that's something positive for me. But if you're someone who prefers very action-packed and fast-paced fantasy, that's just something to consider. This is not exactly something that you will get in the first book. And also another reason why it can seem quite slow-paced is that since this does have a big political aspect to it as well, within the politics of the city, and there are a lot of characters and a lot of factions that you kind of have to, you know, find out who is who and kind of get a grasp on, that can also make it seem more slow-paced. I personally think that the way the exposition is done and the way that you're introduced to the different factions and to the different characters, etc., is really, really well done, because there's hardly any exposition dumps. Again, personally, I am not someone who always minds exposition dumps, because I think sometimes that's just necessary in fantasy to get you as the reader caught up within what is going on and within the story, etc. However, within this one, I just think, like, the way the exposition is done is probably one of my favorite ways of how the exposition can be done. We're usually given a lot of the information within the scenes as they are important, and we're given them in just very bite-sized little pieces, which makes it, I wouldn't say easy to follow everything, because again, there's just a lot of elements, and for me it definitely needed the second read of the first book to like really grasp everything and to remember all the names, etc. But then again, I'm also really bad at remembering elements, so maybe that's just me. So yeah, the exposition is just done really, really well for me, and it just perfectly works in harmony with the plot. And so that's just something that I very much prefer in terms of how exposition can be done. The plot, as I said, it is quite slow-paced, and there are a lot of different elements to the plot. However, you want to follow it constantly. At least I did. I just loved how contained the plot was in the first book, because in the first book, Ren's story pretty much takes precedent over all other plot points going on. And again, it's one of my preferred ways of how stories can be written, when the first book, the plot in the first book is still very contained and then widens up within the rest of the series, because it gives us as the readers a chance to kind of get familiar with the world, get familiar with the characters, while not having to follow too complicated of a plot. And once the plot gets going and gets more complicated, we already have a grasp of the characters and of the world, and so it's easier to follow along with the plot. While when you just start with a huge ass plot right off at the very beginning, and you also have to be introduced to the world and the characters and everything, it just sometimes gets too much. But that is not the case here, as I said, because we mostly follow Ren, especially the first half of the first book. I remember talking about that also with my other review, just very much personally focuses on Ren while we're already introduced to some other characters. And then in the second half, the plot opens up, and with the plot opening up in the second half, it sets the stage to what's going to happen in the later books. And with the way that's done, that's just ideal for me as a fantasy reader, because again, with a lot of factions or having to deal with a lot of factions, I'm kind of used to that. I'm used to that confusion, but it's just done in a way to minimize that. Continuing on with the plot in the second and the third book, I do really love the plot. I love how the personal stories kind of intertwine with the bigger story. However, I have to say that I did think personally the way that the plot is very tight and very contained, probably I like the most in the first book. The second book, it's kind of hard. Like, I could not tell you which one my favorite book was within the series. Probably book 1 or book 2, I have to be honest. But I like book 1 and book 2 for very different reasons. Like, book 1 I preferred in terms of plot and in the way the plot was presented. Book 2 I preferred with the character relationships and with the character progressions. And then book 3 was just, I still really love book 3. I gave all 3 books 5 out of 5 stars. And I am someone, I differentiate within the series. So a lot of times, even if a series is all 5 out of 5s in the big picture and compared to other books I read, I might sometimes give a book 4 stars because I enjoy that less. However, with this series I just wanted to give them all 5 stars. Anyway, I'm getting rambly. Back to the plot. The second book